The lobby of Sterling Aerospace smelled like money. Not the paper kind, the polished kind. Cold marble, fresh lilies, changed twice a day, and cologne so expensive it announced a man before he opened his mouth. The floor was white Italian stone, buffed until it threw the ceiling lights back up at you. And every morning at 8, the executives walked across it like it owed them something. Into that cathedral of glass and money walked a man with a mop. His name was Marcus Ellison, 58 years old. Gray uniform, faded at the collar. Shoes so worn the right sole had split, and when he walked, it made a small wet squeak against the marble. Squeak, squeak, a sound the marble had never been designed to hear. Nobody looked at him. That was the point of a man like Marcus. He was background, a gray shape that appeared before the important people arrived and vanished before they noticed. He pushed his cart with the squeaky wheel toward the coffee station, and he began, quietly, to clean up a spill somebody else had left behind. He did not know that in 90 seconds, a young man in a $4,000 suit was going to change the entire trajectory of his morning. And he did not know, because Marcus never announced anything, that the young man was about to make the single worst mistake of his career. Let me ask you something before we go on. Have you ever been treated like you were invisible? Like the floor mattered more than you did? Then you already understand Marcus better than anyone in that lobby ever would? Blake Harrington arrived at 8:14, the way he always arrived. Fast, loud, and certain. The world had been built for him to be late to. He was 34. Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Aerospace for exactly 11 months. Handsome, in the way that expensive haircuts make men handsome. He had a coffee in one hand and a phone against his ear, and he was arguing with someone about numbers he didn't fully understand, but was very confident about. He crossed the marble without watching where he walked, and his shoulder clipped Marcus's cart. The coffee went sideways. A long dark splash hit the white floor, spread across the polished stone, and this is the part Blake decided to remember differently later. A few drops caught the bottom of his trouser leg. Blake stopped. He looked down at the stain on his trousers. Then he looked at the old man in the gray uniform holding a mop. And whatever civilized thing was supposed to happen next did not happen. Are you serious? Blake's voice cut across the lobby. Heads turned. Do you not watch where you're standing? That was my fault, sir, Marcus said. Calm. Level. He was already reaching for his rag. Let me get that for you. But Blake wasn't listening. There was an audience, now a dozen employees frozen at the elevators. A security guard by the door. A young engineer named Daniel Cho standing near the reception desk, with his access badge still in his hand. And an audience did something ugly to a man like Blake. It turned a small moment into a stage. He looked Marcus up and down. The faded uniform, the split shoe, the cart with the squeaky wheel, and he said it, "Mop the floor, monkey." The lobby went silent. The kind of silence that has a temperature. Cold. Nobody moved. Daniel Cho felt his own face go hot, felt the word land in his chest like something he should stand up against, and he said nothing. He looked down at his badge. He told himself it wasn't his fight. Remember Daniel. He matters later. Marcus Ellison did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise his eyes in anger. For one long second he simply held the young man's gaze, and there was something in that stillness that made Blake, for just a flicker, uncertain. Something a man learns only after a lifetime of being underestimated. The stillness of a person who has already decided that your opinion of him is not his problem. Then Marcus knelt. His split shoe squeaked against the marble. His cracked hands, dry from years of bleach and cold water, pressed the rag to the floor and began, slowly, to wipe the coffee away. Blake smiled. He'd won, and he wanted everyone to see him win. "Look at that," he said to no one, and everyone. "You know, my father used to say you can dress this building up all you want. Put in the marble, put in the lilies, but you still have to keep the help from tracking their mess everywhere." He crouched slightly, mock-friendly, the way cruelty sometimes disguises itself as advice. "Here's a life lesson, old-timer. Some people build things, and some people clean up after the people who build things. Know which one you are. Stay in your lane." He straightened his jacket. He checked his reflection in the marble. "Wipe it up," he said, "and try to be invisible. That's the one thing you're good at." And he walked toward the executive elevator. Coffee refilled by a terrified assistant, already back on his phone. the whole thing forgotten before the doors even closed. Marcus stayed on his knees a moment longer than he needed to. He finished the spot. He wiped it until the marble was clean. Then he stood, quietly, and he looked at the closed elevator doors. Imagine you had just been called a monkey in front of a room full of people who chose to stare at their shoes. Imagine you had spent 30 years earning the right to walk into that building, and a boy who inherited his position decided you were less than the floor. What would your face have done? Marcus's face did nothing at all, because Marcus Ellison already knew something that Blake Harrington was about to learn in the most public way imaginable. He knew whose name was on the deed. To understand what happened in the next 10 minutes, you have to understand what Sterling Aerospace actually was and who actually owned it. Sterling was one of the 3 largest avionics firms in the world. Flight control systems, stabilization software, the invisible machinery that keeps a 100-ton aircraft steady when the sky tries to throw it around. If you have ever flown and landed safely in turbulence, there is a decent chance a Sterling system was quietly doing its job beneath your feet. The company had been founded 30 years ago by 2 men. One was a financier named Robert Sterling, who put up the money and got the building named after him. The other man designed the technology that made the company worth anything at all. That man never wanted his name on the building. He never wanted the corner office or the marble lobby. He grew up in a 2-room house where the heat didn't always work. The son of a machinist who fixed other people's engines for a living and taught his boy that a man's worth was in his hands and his honesty, not his address. That man built the core stabilization architecture the system engineers inside Sterling still called the Meridian Core, the beating heart of every product the company sold. And then, when the company was worth billions, and the corporate world grew loud and cruel and obsessed with the wrong things, that man did something almost no one does. He stepped back. He kept his controlling shares. He kept the title of chairman of the board, and he disappeared from the day-to-day, letting professional executives run the machine while he watched from a distance. His wife had died 3 years ago. Cancer. Fast and cruel. She had been a teacher, the kind who stayed late for the student everyone else gave up on, and she had left him a 9-year-old daughter named Zoe and a hole in his chest that money could not fill. After she died, he stopped trusting reports. Reports lied. Reports were polished until they shone like the marble downstairs. He wanted to know what his company had actually become. Not the numbers. The character, the way it treated the people it thought didn't matter. So, a month ago, the chairman of Sterling Aerospace put on a gray uniform, took the night shift janitor's post under a name half the payroll, never bothered to read, and went to see for himself. His name was Marcus Ellison, and Blake Harrington had just called him a monkey and told him to stay in his lane. Marcus rolled his cart into the service corridor. He parked it. He took off the gray jacket and folded it, once, neatly, and set it on top of the cart the way you set down something you're grateful to. From the inside pocket, he took out a ring. It was heavy, old gold, worn smooth at the edges, from decades of being turned over between 2 fingers when he was thinking. On its face was the Sterling crest, the same crest carved into the marble above the lobby doors, the same crest stamped on every board document, on every share certificate, on the letterhead that fired people and hired them. A signet ring. The founder's ring. The chairman's ring. He slid it onto his finger. There is a version of this story where a man in Marcus's position spends the elevator ride rehearsing his revenge, sharpening the cruel thing he'll say, savoring it. Marcus did not do that. He rode the elevator up in silence, watching the floor numbers climb, and what he felt was not triumph. It was something heavier and quieter than triumph. It was the tired weight of a man who has just had his oldest suspicion confirmed, that the thing he built with his own hands had grown a rot at the top, and that he was going to have to cut it out himself. The elevator opened on the 30th floor, the boardroom, because, and here is the small, brutal irony that Blake would spend the rest of his life trying to forget, there was a board meeting scheduled for 8:30 that very morning. A meeting Blake was walking into right now, straightening his tie, certain he was the most important person in the room. A quarterly review, contracts, the company's future. The chairman was expected. The board had been told he would finally be attending in person after 3 years of appearing only by encrypted video. His camera off. His voice, the only presence in the room. None of them knew what he looked like. That is the thing about power that hides. It gets to watch you be yourself. Blake was mid-sentence when the door opened. He was standing at the head of the long glass table, 12 board members seated around it, a presentation glowing on the wall behind him. He had just said the words, "a culture of excellence," and he genuinely believed them. When the door at the far end of the room opened, and a man in a faded gray janitor's uniform trousers walked in, Blake laughed. He actually laughed. "You've got to be kidding me. Sir, this is a closed board meeting. The service floor is—" He turned to his assistant. "How did he even get up here?" "Get security. Get him out." Marcus didn't stop walking. He crossed the room, unhurried, that faint squeak of the split shoe following him across the expensive carpet now, and he walked to the empty chair at the head of the table. The chairman's chair. The one seat in the building nobody sat in. He pulled it out, and he sat down. "Sir," Blake's voice climbed. Get up. That is not—" "Sit down, Mr. Harrington," Marcus said. He did not say it loudly. That was what made it land. He said it the way you tell the truth, to someone who has run out of room to argue. And then an old woman near the middle of the table, Eleanor Voss, 71 years old, the longest-serving director on the board, a woman who had been in the room the day the company was incorporated, rose slowly from her seat. She looked at the man in the gray uniform. She looked at the ring on his finger, and she said, "Good morning, Marcus." She turned to the stunned table, her voice steady with something close to relief. "Ladies and gentlemen, our chairman." The room did not breathe. Blake's face went through several colors. His mouth opened, closed. "That's—" He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the ring. He looked at the face of the man he had, 11 minutes ago, ordered to mop a floor and be invisible. "That's not possible. He's the— I saw him downstairs. He's the janitor." "Yes," Marcus said. "You did see me downstairs." He laid his cracked hands flat on the glass table, the founder's ring catching the light. "You told me to mop the floor," Marcus said quietly. "So I mopped it. You told me to stay in my lane." He paused. "This is my lane, Mr. Harrington. I built it. My name is on the shares that pay for the marble you were so worried I'd track mud across. My signature hired the man who hired you." He let that sit. The board sat frozen. Somewhere a phone buzzed, and no one dared touch it. "I have spent the last month," Marcus continued, "cleaning this building at night and watching it during the day. I wanted to know what my company had become. Not the reports, the truth. Whether the people at the top of Sterling Aerospace had any idea that the people at the bottom are human beings." He looked at Blake. "You answered that question for me this morning, clearly. In front of a dozen witnesses, you didn't call me that word because you thought I was a criminal. You called me that word because you thought I was nothing. And a man who treats the invisible like they're nothing will treat the customers, the shareholders, and the people who fly on our aircraft exactly the same way the moment he thinks no one is watching. End." He turned the ring on his finger. "Once. Clean out your desk, Mr. Harrington. You're relieved as of this moment. Now, if you have been cheering, and I don't blame you, I want you to slow down, because this is exactly where an ordinary story would end. The villain humiliated, the good man vindicated. Roll the credits." But Marcus Ellison had made one small miscalculation. He thought Blake Harrington would fall quietly. Men like Blake do not fall quietly. They fall like buildings, and they try to take everyone underneath them down too. Blake's shock lasted about 4 seconds. Then something colder moved behind his eyes. Because Blake had a card, and he was about to play it, and for a few long minutes, it was going to look like it might work. "You can't fire me," Blake said. And now his voice had changed smooth again. Controlled. The voice of a man who negotiates for a living. "Not this morning. Not this week." He looked around the table, gathering the frightened directors like an audience. "You want to talk about the truth of this company, Mr. Chairman? Here's the truth. The Meridian Core, the flagship system, the one everything we sell is built on, is failing, right now. In final validation for the transatlantic contract, the single biggest contract in this company's history, $2.4 billion. The temperature of the room shifted. 2 directors sat forward. "Our engineers have been on it for 3 weeks, Blake said. "The best avionics team money can buy. They can't find it. The system throws a stabilization fault under high-load turbulence simulation, and nobody knows why. If we don't deliver a clean validation by Friday, the contract walks. 2.4 billion. Gone. Plus, the reputational collapse. Plus the lawsuits. He straightened. He was almost enjoying it now. So go ahead. Fire the only CEO who's been managing this crisis. Put the janitor in charge. He said the word like a blade. You inherited a company, Mr. Ellison. You held some shares and let real professionals build the value. You don't know the first thing about the technology that keeps this company alive. So unless you can walk into that lab and fix a defect that a team of PhD engineers couldn't crack in 3 weeks, he spread his hands. You need me, and everyone at this table knows it. He sat down in a chair that wasn't his to sit in, and he smiled. And this is the moment worth remembering. Because 2 of the directors were nodding. The fear in the room had found a handhold. Eleanor Voss looked at Marcus, and even she, even his oldest ally, had a flicker of doubt in her eyes. They all thought the same thing. Blake had said it out loud, and now they were all thinking it. He's the money man. The founder's shares. Old story. He signed the checks and let the smart people build the machine. He can't fix this. Nobody can. Marcus Ellison sat very still at the head of the table, and here is what nobody in that room knew. Nobody knew who had designed the Meridian core. Let me take you back 32 years, because to understand what Marcus did next, you have to understand a boy in a cold 2-room house and the father who taught him. Marcus grew up poor, not television poor, real poor. His father, Isaac Ellison, was a machinist, a black man in a town that did not make life easy for black men who were better at their jobs than the men who supervised them. Isaac fixed engines, lathes, generators, anything with moving parts and a broken heart. And he did it better than anyone. And he got paid less than everyone. And he never once let that make him small. Isaac kept a notebook, a worn leather notebook, the cover soft as cloth from 30 years of grease and thumbs. In it, in his careful, deliberate handwriting, he wrote down every principle he ever learned about how things move and why they fail. Not the formulas from the textbooks he was never allowed to attend. His own laws. The truths he'd earned with his hands. And on the winter nights when the heat cut out, Isaac would sit his son at the kitchen table, open that notebook, and teach. Everybody looks at the part that broke, Isaac told him once, tracing a diagram with a pencil worn down to a stub. That's their mistake. The part that broke is almost never where the problem started. You want to find the truth of a machine, Marcus. You don't ask where it hurts. You ask where the pressure came from. You trace it back and back and back, until you find the one quiet place where a small wrong thing was allowed to hold. He tapped the page. The failure is loud. The cause is always quiet. Learn to listen for the quiet. Marcus solved his first real engineering problem at that kitchen table when he was 11 years old. His father looked at the answer for a long time. Then he wrote, in the margin of that leather notebook, next to his son's work, a single small mark, a check, and beside it the words, "This one sees." Marcus kept that notebook after his father died. He added to it his whole life, every principle, every hard-won law of how things move and why they fail. When he designed the Meridian core 30 years ago, the mathematics that made it work, the thing no competitor was ever able to copy, did not come from a university he was never allowed to attend. It came from a machinist's leather notebook and a cold kitchen table and a father who said, learn to listen for the quiet. Now, come back to the boardroom. Come back to the man in the gray uniform, sitting still while a room full of frightened people decided he was only good for signing checks. He reached into the folded jacket on the chair beside him, and he took out a worn leather notebook, soft as cloth, its cover dark with 30 years of thumbs. Mr. Harrington, Marcus said, you told me a moment ago that some people build things, and some people clean up after them. He set the notebook on the glass table. You were right. I'd just like everyone to be clear about which one I am. He opened it. The board leaned in despite themselves. The Meridian core, Marcus said, throws a stabilization fault under high-load turbulence. Your team has spent 3 weeks looking at where it hurts at the fault itself, at the code that reports it, and they've found nothing, because the fault is not the problem. The fault is the loud part. The cause is quiet. He turned the notebook toward Eleanor Voss. I designed this system, Eleanor. Every branch of it. The architecture your engineers are treating like scripture. I wrote it at a kitchen table before this building existed. He looked up, and for the first time there was something almost gentle in his voice. You don't have to take my word for it. Get me into the validation lab. Give me a terminal and the fault logs, and I'll show you exactly where the quiet, wrong thing is holding. There was a silence, and then Eleanor Voss, who had been in the room the day the company was born, who was the only person alive besides Marcus who remembered the founder actually building anything, stood up and said, The lab. Now, all of us. The validation lab was 2 floors down. Cold, bright, humming with servers. It smelled of ozone and machine-cooled air, and under it, faintly, the coffee somebody had spilled hours ago and no one had cleaned, because the man who cleaned this building was standing at the terminal now in a founder's ring and a janitor's trousers. 6 of the company's senior engineers were already there, exhausted, 3 weeks deep, surrounded by whiteboards covered in failed theories. Among them, near the back, stood a young engineer named Daniel Cho. You remember Daniel? He was in the lobby this morning. He looked down at his badge, while a man was called a monkey, and he said nothing, and it had been sitting in his chest like a swallowed stone ever since. When Daniel saw the janitor from the lobby walk into the lab as chairman, his face went pale, then red, then something else, something that looked a great deal like a decision being made. Marcus sat at the terminal. He pulled up the fault logs, and to a room of people who expected a rich old man to fumble, he began to move through the data the way a musician moves through a piece he wrote himself. Not reading, remembering. The fault report's here, he said, at the stabilization layer. Everyone's been living in this layer for 3 weeks. He scrolled back. Back. But watch the load values before the fault. Watch the boundary condition when the simulation crosses into high turbulence. His cracked finger touched the screen. There. 2 layers upstream. Someone modified the boundary threshold in the pre-processing stage. A small change. The kind of change you'd make without blinking. And it works perfectly until the load crosses this exact value, and the system carries a corrupted assumption forward into everything downstream. The stabilization layer isn't failing. It's faithfully executing a lie it was handed 2 steps earlier. The senior engineers crowded in. One of them, the lead, went very quiet. He pulled up the change history, and his face changed. That threshold, the lead engineer said slowly, was modified 6 weeks ago. He scrolled. The modification was flagged in internal review. The reviewer recommended it be rolled back before validation. He looked up. The recommendation was overridden by executive order. The room turned, as one, to look at Blake Harrington. Here is where the second door opened. And here is where Daniel Cho finally stood up. I have to say something, Daniel said. His voice shook, but he said it. I was the reviewer. Every head turned. 6 weeks ago, I flagged that threshold change. I wrote in the report that it created an unsafe assumption under high load and had to be rolled back before we could certify the system for a passenger aircraft. He swallowed. I was told to remove the flag. I was told the schedule couldn't take a delay, that the transatlantic contract was worth more than my caution, that if I wanted a future at this company, I'd learn which fights were worth having. His jaw tightened. I kept the original report, and the email telling me to bury it. I kept all of it. I've had it on a drive in my desk for 6 weeks, telling myself it wasn't my fight. No. He pulled a small drive from his pocket and set it on the table beside Marcus's leather notebook. It was my fight, Daniel said. I should have said something in the lobby this morning, too. I'm sorry, sir. I'm saying it now. Marcus looked at the young man for a long moment. And what he felt was not vindication. It was something closer to hope. The bravest thing a person can do, Marcus said quietly, is speak the second time, after they stayed quiet the first. Most people never manage it. He nodded at the drive. Thank you, Mr. Cho. Blake by the wall had stopped smiling a long time ago. This is, he started. That threshold change improved our timeline. It was a judgment call. Every executive makes. You overrode a safety flag on a passenger flight control system, Marcus said. And now, Finally, there was iron in his voice, not cruelty. Iron, to protect a delivery schedule. You knew the system carried an unsafe assumption. You hid it. You were going to certify it, sell it, and put it under the feet of everyone who flies on a Sterling aircraft. And when it was quietly failing in the lab, you stood in front of my board and blamed the technology, and used the crisis you created to make yourself untouchable. He closed the leather notebook. You didn't just insult a janitor this morning, Mr. Harrington. That I could have forgiven. People say cruel things when they think no one who matters is listening, and sometimes they learn. He stood. But you were willing to gamble other people's lives to hide a mistake and keep your title? That is not a thing I get to forgive. That is a thing the federal regulators get to review. It moved fast after that. Truth usually does, once someone finally lets it into the room. The board voted before they left the lab. Blake Harrington was removed as chief executive officer, effective immediately not by one man's anger, but by 12 people who had just watched him gamble their company and their consciences on a lie. But the firing was the smallest of what came for him, because a concealed safety defect on a passenger flight control system is not an internal matter. It is a federal one. Within a week, aviation safety regulators had opened a formal investigation. Daniel Cho's original report, the buried email, the override order with Blake's authorization on it, all of it went into the file. The transatlantic contract was paused, not because the technology had failed, but because the company insisted on revalidating the entire system honestly before a single aircraft flew. It cost Sterling money and time. Marcus signed off on every dollar of it without hesitation. We will lose this quarter, he told the board, and we will keep every person who ever trusts their life to one of our systems. If that trade is difficult for anyone in this room, resign now. Nobody resigned. Blake Harrington did not simply lose a job. He lost his career. His name attached itself to a federal safety investigation, and in an industry where trust is the only real currency, that is a wound that does not close. The professional network that had made him feel invincible evaporated in a season. The story of what he'd done, and, in whispers, the story of how he'd been caught. The janitor, and the ring, and the notebook followed him into every room he tried to enter afterward. He had wanted, that morning, in the lobby, for everyone to remember him a certain way. They remembered. That is the thing about cruelty performed for an audience. The audience does not forget who was cruel. It only waits to find out who was right. Somebody in that lab had filmed the boardroom. Of course they had. In an age where everyone carries a camera, the truth no longer stays in the room it happened in. The clip that spread was not the engineering. Nobody outside aerospace understands boundary thresholds. The clip that spread was the human thing. The janitor with the split shoe, called a monkey in a marble lobby, told to stay in his lane and be invisible, and then, 10 minutes later, that same man, in the same gray trousers, sitting down in the founder's chair, laying a dead father's leather notebook on a glass table, and quietly dismantling the empire of the man who'd humiliated him. It reached millions. It reached people who had never flown a day in their lives, who would never understand a stabilization fault, but who understood exactly what it feels like to be treated as less than the floor. The comments filled with their own stories. The nurse whose competence was ignored until the moment it saved someone. The immigrant father whose accent made strangers assume he was stupid. The kid working 2 jobs, whom a manager once called the help. Thousands of people saying the same thing in 1,000 ways. I have been the invisible one. And I have prayed for a morning exactly like this. But if you had asked Marcus Ellison about the views, he wouldn't have known the number. He was not watching. He had a daughter to pick up from school. 3 weeks later, Sterling Aerospace announced something that had never appeared in its quarterly reports. The Isaac Ellison Workshop, a training program funded directly by the chairman, named for a machinist who never got to see a company that would honor him, built to find brilliant hands in places the professional world never bothers to look. Not the graduates of expensive schools, the night shift workers taking classes when they could, the kids from cold 2-room houses who saw machines the way other children see friends, the ones who see the quiet cause when everyone else is staring at the loud fault. The program would find them, train them, and put them to work at the highest level of the company. Because Marcus Ellison had spent a lifetime knowing that genius is distributed evenly across every neighborhood, and every skin color, and every income, and only opportunity is hoarded. He asked Daniel Cho to help build it. Me? Daniel said. Sir, I stayed quiet. Twice, almost. I'm the last person. You're exactly the right person, Marcus said. You know how heavy the stone gets, sitting in your chest, when you don't speak. You'll teach these kids to put it down faster than you did. That's worth more than someone who's never carried it. Daniel took the job. There is a small last thing, and I want to tell it to you, because it's the part Marcus would say actually mattered. That evening, Marcus picked his daughter Zoe up from school in the same gray uniform he'd worn all month, because he'd forgotten to change, and because he genuinely did not care. She was 9, and she had her mother's stubbornness and her mother's eyes, and she climbed into the car and told him a boy in her class had said her dad was just a cleaner. What did you tell him? Marcus asked. I said cleaners keep everything working and rich people just sit on top of it, Zoe said, buckling her seatbelt with fierce concentration. And I said my dad can fix anything. Marcus was quiet for a second. Then he reached over and very gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind his daughter's ear with a cracked, careful hand. Your grandfather, he said, used to say almost exactly that. He drove them home. He did not tell her about the boardroom or the ring or the millions of strangers. That could wait. Some things a child gets to learn slowly. But that night, after she was asleep, Marcus opened the leather notebook to the last page his father ever wrote in, and beneath Isaac Ellison's careful handwriting, he added one more line. His own hand now, older than his father's, had been that winter at the kitchen table. They looked down on us, he wrote. So we lifted someone up. That's the only revenge worth having. Then he closed the notebook, and he placed his hand flat on the worn leather cover, and he held it there. So here's the question, and I want you to actually sit with it, because the comments are full of people who already know their answer. That morning in the lobby, a man was humiliated in front of a room full of people. And every single person in that room had a choice. Most of them chose their shoes. One of them, Daniel, chose his shoes too, at first, and it took him weeks to find his voice. Marcus Ellison didn't win because he was secretly the chairman. The ring didn't make him right. He was right in the lobby, on his knees, with a mop, before anyone knew his name, when he chose dignity over a shout, and let his character speak before his power ever had to. The lesson isn't be secretly rich. The lesson is simpler and harder. Be the person whose worth doesn't depend on who's watching. And when you see someone treated like they're invisible, don't wait until you find out who they really are. Treat them right while they're still nobody. That's the whole test. So tell me, if you'd been standing in that lobby this morning, badge in your hand, everyone else staring at the floor, would you have stayed quiet? Or would you have been the one who spoke the first time? Drop your answer below. Share this with the person in your life who taught you that a man's worth is in his hands and his honesty, not his address. And subscribe, because the invisible ones have more stories than the powerful ever will. We're just getting started telling them.